Ken Shamrock's name once stood at the very center of combat sports. For years, he was marketed as the world's most dangerous man. He fought in the very first UFC. He headlined cards in Japan. He even crossed over into the world of professional wrestling and became a household name. But time has a way of shifting narratives. Today, the pioneer who helped lay the foundation for mixed martial arts is rarely mentioned. His story, one of survival, glory, and decline, has been largely left in the shadows. This is the rise and fall of Ken Shamrock, a legend whose journey began long before cages, belts, or pay-per-view lights. His fight started in childhood. Born Kenneth Kilpatrick in Macon, Georgia, Ken's earliest years were filled with instability. He bounced from abusive homes to the streets. By the age of 13, he had already been stabbed, beaten, and abandoned. But instead of breaking him, those experiences hardened him. He learned to fight back, to endure, to survive. His life changed when he met Bob Shamrock, a man who ran a group home for troubled boys. Bob not only gave Ken structure and discipline, but also adopted him as his son. Under Bob's guidance, Ken discovered wrestling, athletics, and a sense of belonging. It was the beginning of a path that would eventually lead him into uncharted territory in the fight world. Ken first entered professional wrestling in the late 1980s, but it was in Japan where he truly made his name. Competing in the Pancrase organization, he became part of a groundbreaking style that blended grappling and striking, a precursor to modern MMA. The fights were raw, unscripted, and unforgiving. Ken thrived in the chaos, refusing to tap out, fighting through pain, and winning over Japanese fans who saw him as a true warrior. They crowned him the King of Pancrase. In 1993, the combat sports world shifted. The Ultimate Fighting Championship held its first tournament, and Ken Shamrock was there. A muscular grappler with piercing eyes and a stone jaw, he looked like a real-life action figure, the face of this new experiment in no-holds-barred fighting. At UFC 1, he submitted Patrick Smith with ease before being submitted himself by Royce Gracie, the Brazilian jiu-jitsu master. That loss wasn't the end. It became fuel. Ken returned at UFC 3, then at UFC 5, where he fought Gracie again, this time to a 36-minute draw. The bout helped define the raw unpredictability of early MMA. Ken went on to win the first Superfight Championship, an early version of the UFC title, and his reputation as the world's most dangerous man only grew. But the early UFC was not built for riches. Pay was low, sponsorships rare, and mainstream respect non-existent. Fighters like Shamrock put their health and futures on the line for pennies. By the mid-1990s, Ken realized that the sport he helped pioneer might not provide long-term security. That's when the World Wrestling Federation came calling. In 1997, Shamrock made the leap to professional wrestling, trading real combat for scripted entertainment. To some, it was a confusing move, but to Ken, it was opportunity. The WWF offered better pay, bigger exposure, and a chance to extend his career. He debuted as a legitimate tough guy in a world of characters and gimmicks. His reputation as a real fighter made him stand out. Fans bought into his intensity. Within a year, he was battling stars like The Rock, Triple H, and The Undertaker. He won the Intercontinental Championship and the King of the Ring tournament in 1998. For a while, it seemed he had successfully transitioned from cage fighter to wrestling star. But Ken was living two lives. He still trained like a real fighter, and never stopped seeing himself as one. Behind the curtain, the WWF's grueling schedule, endless travel, and physical toll wore him down. The hunger to fight for real never left. By the early 2000s, as the UFC grew under new ownership and fighters like Tito, Ortiz, and Chuck Liddell rose to prominence, Ken decided to return. But the sport had changed. When Shamrock re-entered the UFC in 2002, he wasn't walking into the same world he had left. The no-rules brawling of the early days was gone. Now there were weight classes, athletic commissions, sanctioning, and younger, faster fighters. Ken's return fight was against Tito Ortiz, the brash young champion who mocked Shamrock at every turn. It was billed as old guard versus new blood. The result was brutal. Ortiz dominated Shamrock with ground and pound until the referee stopped it. Shamrock, bloodied and dazed, responded with a middle finger in defiance. But the message was clear. The game had passed him by. He fought Ortiz twice more, losing both times. He also lost to other contenders, including Rich Franklin and Kazushi Sakuraba. His speed was gone, his body worn down. The world's most dangerous man was no longer feared. Still, he kept fighting, partly out of pride, partly out of necessity. Fans began to turn, not out of dislike, but out of sadness. The man who once defined toughness was now a reminder of time's toll. The relationship with the UFC soured further. Dana White, The outspoken president publicly dismissed Shamrock. He called him irrelevant, mocked him in press conferences, and minimized his role in UFC history. For a man who helped launch the sport, it was a painful erasure. At the same time, financial troubles mounted. Early UFC paydays had been meager, and even WWF salaries in the 1990s couldn't sustain him for life. Years of travel, injuries, and medical bills added up. By the late 2000s, Ken faced debts, lawsuits, and bankruptcy. The blows kept coming. In 2008, just before a scheduled fight, Shamrock tested positive for steroids. He denied intentional use but admitted his body was breaking down. The suspension and fine crushed his remaining credibility. Sponsors backed away, promoters lost interest, and his marketability plummeted. Legal disputes followed. Most notably, Shamrock sued the UFC over unpaid licensing fees, claiming his likeness was being used without permission. The battle turned ugly. In the end, Shamrock lost in court and lost even more standing in the sport. By the 2010s, his name was rarely mentioned by the organization he helped create. While contemporaries like Royce, Gracie, Chuck Liddell, and Randy Couture were inducted into the UFC Hall of Fame, Shamrock was left out. Dana White made his feelings clear. Shamrock wasn't welcome. The result was devastating. A man once synonymous with MMA had become a footnote. Younger fans knew his name only from old clips or, worse, from late-career highlight reels of him losing. His pioneering days in Pancrase, his battles with Gracie, his role in legitimizing MMA, all of it was fading. Shamrock kept trying to fight for relevance. In 2015, he returned in Bellator to face Kimbo Slice, another spectacle fight. He lost. In 2016, he fought Royce Gracie one last time. The bout ended quickly, anticlimactically, a shell of their rivalry. He later attempted to launch Valor Bare Knuckle, his own fighting promotion. He promised fighter-friendly contracts and a return to raw combat. But the events drew little attention, and the project quietly disappeared. Behind the scenes, his personal struggles mirrored his professional ones. His relationship with his adopted brother, Frank Shamrock, remained fractured. Their feud stretched on for decades, filled with bitterness and disappointment. His marriages suffered under the weight of fame, travel, and fighting. Reconnecting with his children became a painful process. Physically, the toll was immense. Years of punishment left him with chronic pain, surgeries, and lasting injuries. He's spoken about memory lapses, anxiety, and isolation. Emotionally, the hardest part wasn't the pain, but the silence. Shamrock has often admitted how deeply it hurts to feel forgotten by the sport he helped build. In interviews, he's recalled those early UFC days, when there were just 8 men fighting in a cage for respect. "They act like I was never there," he once said, "but I remember." In recent years, he's leaned on faith, speaking openly about his Christianity, and finding some peace in sharing his story with churches and small audiences. But even with faith, the scars remain. Today, Ken Shamrock is still alive, still training, still sharing pieces of his journey. He appears at fan expos, podcasts, and small wrestling shows. On social media, he posts motivational words and clips from his fights. But the reaction is small, the applause quiet. The tragedy of Ken Shamrock's story isn't the injuries or the losses. It's the silence. The fact that a man who helped build MMA has been pushed aside, rarely honored, often overlooked. Shamrock doesn't ask for pity. He doesn't beg for recognition. But his story raises a question: should the sport remember its pioneers?